My overarching thesis for today, I'm looking at the intersections between childbirth, German midwifery education, and racial policy within a broader transnational climate of eugenics thinking from the end of the 19th century to its apex in the 1940s. Specifically, I'm focusing on how the formalization of a book-based curriculum for German midwives became a tool for exposing them, and by extension the women they served, to pro-natalist rhetoric. That's the long description. The short description is I'm looking at the significance of minutiae and the role that minutiae can play in exposing us to eugenic rhetoric. By way of opening, I'd like to put my talk into two broader contexts. The first one, I want to draw your attention back to the very first speaker of this conference when he said, education is job number one in every country because education determines the security of a country. And for those of us who were in this room with the Science in the Service of Nazi Ideology panel, the quote from Francis Cam, our choices tell us what we can actually believe. Education is an idealized sentiment, and childbirth is an idealized sentiment. Both reflect what a nation plans to do. It does not necessarily reflect what happens. So I'm taking a top-down perspective. I will not be talking from the perspective of what midwives themselves actually did, but what those in authority hoped to achieve. The second context I want to give you, for those of you who are less familiar with midwifery and German midwifery in particular, when you talk to many German midwives today, they point to Reich Association midwifery leader Nana Conti as the savior of their occupation. She was part of the crew that was instrumental in passing the national midwifery law, the first nationalized midwifery law in Germany in 1938. What these women are doing, modern-day midwives are doing, is they're overlooking crimes that may or may not have been committed by midwives in this period. What they're also applying is a very, very gendered argument. They're overlooking the complicity, making the argument that women, because they are women, cannot be perpetrators, right? And childbirth is, by its very nature, apolitical. And these are some of the things that I plan to problematize in today's presentation. So I argue that childbirth is not only biological, it is also socially constructed. While the internal or biological process experienced by expectant and laboring mothers has remained constant over time and across cultures, for example, the developmental stages of a fetus, the external environments defining the delivery space, what individuals beyond the laboring woman are allowed into that space, the placement of the laboring woman's body, and who is perceived as possessing expert knowledge regarding best practices of labor and delivery change significantly. For example, at the turn of this last century, industrialized nations began swapping, quote, dirty midwives for, quote, clean hospitals, as doctors and state officials replaced traditional female-centered apprenticeship practices with male-centered classroom-based training. During this process, midwifery all but disappeared in many countries, often being supplanted by hospital-trained obstetrical nurses. However, the story unfolds very differently in Germany, where midwives organized and pushed to retain their autonomous status. Starting in 1885, a small cadre of German women, led by midwife Olga Gebauer, dedicated themselves to professionalizing their occupation, including achieving markers such as creating a national body and publishing a journal for practitioners. They worked for midwifery's acceptance and integration within institutionalized medicine, and such engagement is significant because it helps explain why midwives have continued to have a visible presence in Germany, not only up through the 40s, but even today. The timing of midwives' move to save their craft is also important. 2 years earlier, Englishman Francis Galton had coined the term eugenics, effectively launching decades of international scientific and public interest in improving societal health through the practices of racial hygiene. This meant German midwives were organizing concurrently with emerging agendas of racial superiority developed by men like Galton, James Davenport, and Alfred Plotz. I am not arguing that midwives' desire to retain control of their craft should be attributed to racial hygiene. However, state sympathy towards positive eugenics certainly helped midwives call for occupational autonomy, as those in power began regarding women as a useful tool for promoting positive eugenics. Proponents argued that while a midwife was attending a laboring woman's home birth, she could simultaneously serve as the eyes and ears of the state, reporting on the family's adherence to prescribed racial doctrine. By 1939, German midwives had received enough official and public recognition that some obstetricians began to worry that the women were receiving unfair legislative advantages, and this prompted the men to launch a formal petition curtailing government promotions of home births. This was not an unfounded concern, because remember that the national laws were passed in 1938, and by 1939, Nana Conti's son, Leonardo Conti, was Reich Health Minister. So midwives had a very, very powerful, potential powerful position within the Third Reich. Okay. This occupational tension between midwives and obstetricians influenced the training of both groups. Midwives were exposed to eugenic thinking in a far different, more organic way than obstetricians. In addition to explicitly pro-eugenic statements, the choice of illustrations, typeface, and even the absence of information all served to educate the women about their role in the new pronatalist state. And at this point, I want to turn my focus to look at some specific examples from textbooks. Okay. And what you need to understand with textbooks is, although the German midwifery leaders were involving themselves in proper practices and debates about occupational ethics and educational reforms, they had stepped away from textbook editing. In fact, according to one source, the first textbook in Germany written by midwives for midwives did not appear until the 1990s. Instead, most of these textbooks, or all of these textbooks, are being written by obstetrical doctors who are serving two groups. They're obstetrical students, overwhelmingly male, and then midwives. Okay. These men, of course, then had to create a division, and it came down this way. Normal births became the purview of midwives, while obstetricians would address all other cases, including those involving pathologies or requiring surgical intervention. This division was not simply a matter of convenience. It also reflected the unique loyalties held by each group. In keeping with years of tradition, midwives' focus was directed inward, towards serving a specific local community. In the age of eugenics and hypernationalism, that community expanded to include all racially purified German folk. In contrast, the obstetricians' focus extended beyond geographical boundaries. Their primary adherence was to a larger transnational scientific community, and this was reflected in their textbooks. German obstetrical guides tended to be published more frequently than their midwifery counterparts, sometimes every second year. The authors and editors justified these new editions by saying that students needed increased access to the latest cutting-edge scientific technology. They were imposing textbooks, often twice the size of midwifery textbooks, and they addressed more than simply the mechanics of pregnancy, labor, and delivery. They placed emphasis on scientific discovery, using new technologies to explore the subject in minute detail. For example, consider this slide of a sperm. Right? It is not simply one part of the procreative process. It is an entity unto itself, which deserves individual study, as we see it broken down into its parts of minutiae. Contrast to this with the images that appear in American or obstetrical nursing textbooks, in German midwifery textbooks. Here, the sperm returns to its tadpole-like existence. What's interesting in these two diagrams is you see with the American midwifery textbook, there's more of a Darwinian cast to this representation than you see with the midwifery textbook in 43. But this is what I'm talking about when I talk about these implications of the minutiae. The tone in midwifery textbooks is very different. It's subjective rather than objective. It's emotion-driven. Students are told up front that they need a certain kind of moral character and willingness to serve. They're expected to bring passion to their occupation, and their occupation is repeatedly described as one that is both precious and difficult. Midwifery textbooks from their very introductions groomed students to feel a sense of responsibility for the welfare of the growing nation, which in turn created an ideal platform for introducing pronatalist rhetoric. Okay. That said, the references to eugenics in Weimar-era textbooks was pretty sparse, at least in comparison to other countries. But I included the examples from other countries because I want you to see that it isn't just going on in Germany. We see this kind of language coming up in other countries. For example, Joseph B. DeLee published a textbook in the mid-1920s for obstetrical nurses in America, and he writes, 100,000 babies die every year in the United States during delivery, emphasis in the original, and another 100,000 die in the first 4 weeks thereafter. This is 3 times as many men's lives as were lost in the war. And these mothers' and babies' deaths were caused largely due to the process of childbirth itself. Okay, as others in this conference have mentioned, a common tool of eugenic rhetoric was to draw a distinction between useful and useless groups. For example, following World War I, the loss of heroic soldiers was often juxtaposed against unproductive members of society who drained resources without contributing. In the above passage, DeLee drew on the first part of this image, connecting soldiers lost in the war to babies lost in childbirth. Both losses had significance and significant demographic implications in a time when strong populations equal strong nations. This passage also evokes the imagery of childbearing women as quite literally the womb of the nation, and call for properly trained fighters, in this case book-educated obstetrical nurses, to take up arms in the frontline war of race and space. Another example from an American textbook of 1927 wrote, "We cannot build a strong race with sickly and maimed mothers and babies, and we can scarcely have other than sickly and maimed mothers without care. Apparently then our national health is a large measure dependent upon good obstetrics. And good obstetrics include good nursing." Okay, so these American examples from the 1920s also promoted the importance of using state-trained birth assistants as conduits between state policy and the average citizen. Obstetrical nurses were put forward as health teachers. They were designed to be frontline educators. And as one textbook said, their close association with the family would enable them to correct evil habits living within the family domain. This idea of evil habits suggests the scale of the struggle these women were to engage. Okay. Now, these 2 examples I gave came from the American context, but if we shift now to the Nazi era, although it took the Nazis a while in their textbooks to catch up, they surpassed this kind of rhetoric that we see in the American examples. Published in 1943, the Nazi era's midwifery textbook was physically imposing. It was almost 200 pages longer than its predecessor from 1928, and the increased size was due in part to the addition of 2 chapters on population policy and racial purity. Instead of individual paragraphs, this new introduction offered 36 pages, complete with accompanying graphs and statistics, illustrating the catastrophic nature of Germany's falling birth rate. And here you can see just some of the images that are contained in these chapters. Right. And the reason for the necessity of a vigorous pronatalist stance. Midwives are introduced to their new roles of determining racial desirability in the procreative the nation, and the importance of hereditary research and ways to honor the so-called child-rich mothers. The textbooks also argued that not only was the demographic increase vital to Germany's survival, by all means of care must be taken to ensure that the pairing of this demographic increase involved the appropriate mix and no quote-unquote tainted blood. Procreative vigilance was therefore the message that was put forward. Okay. These kinds of chapters were obvious in their intentions. Other examples for midwifery students were slightly less overt but equally important in their exposure to eugenics and hypernational thinking. Consider the example of typeface. Okay. Obstetrical books, scientific textbooks, and indeed all obstetrical nursing books and midwifery textbooks until 1943 were written in a Latinate or Roman typeface. However, most of the German literature appears in Fraktur. Fraktur was considered a national script. It had an identity, right? It represented Germanness. Bismarck himself saw it as the true Germanic font. Right. The script's popularity wavered slightly in the 20th century, but receives new vigor under the Nazis. It was declared the official German script by the Nazis in 1933, and all documents, newspapers, and school books were required to be printed in this. What's interesting is that by 1941, Fraktur had fallen out of favor with the Nazis. They reversed their position and started to call it a Jewish script, and therefore changed the printing. But they did not change Fraktur when it came to Midwifery textbook, published 2 years later. They still put it in Fraktur, which gives us the sense of this tie of the community, the tie of the nationalist identity that's being trained, or these women are being trained within. 4 minutes? Yes. The other ways textbooks subtly influence the education is in how biology is presented. These particular images, 1892, 1920, 1928, you can see 1928 an emphasis on science, but this is what was used to teach the women who are helping to deliver children about female anatomy. And then we turn to 1943, and we have this Leni Riefenstahl-esque image. Right? So again, this very subtle writing in of idealization. Just so that you don't think this stops in 1945, I love these two images. Here's West Germany of 1948 and East Germany of 1947. So in West Germany, you have the knock-kneed, subversive, delicate mother, and in East Germany, you have the tractor driver who will also produce the children of the new communist state. So images are one other way to do it. The other thing that we see in Nazi-era midwifery textbooks is we see an absence of birth anomaly. Right? There's going to be no reference to women who are undesirable and producing because they have been, quote unquote, eliminated. What you get instead is the physical representation of the Aryan woman and how she must perform calisthenics in order to keep her body in shape. Pages and pages of these images, followed by the intention that we have one woman on the left, who's 31 years old, about ready to give birth, and you can see the fine form in which she's in. There are no stretch marks. She is ready to bounce back, as we see in the right-hand image, and produce another child. So these are the images. There are no women with deformities. Right? In contrast, obstetrical textbooks, because they are based in science, are still producing images of dwarves or the child on the far right who is actually 6 years old and pregnant. This is an anomaly that most doctors are not going to find, and yet it was deemed too important enough to put into the educational material. So we see this as kind of a different focus. The question of what does this all mean, right? How do examples that I've presented here, the power of the image, the power of the typeface, and nationalist discourse, help our understanding going forward? Well, I argue that it is important to remember that National Socialism and its eugenic platform did not arise overnight or in a vacuum. Instead, it came about gradually, often growing in seemingly harmless ways. One lesson we should learn from this era is the necessity of keeping an eye on educational materials. Education, especially medical education, can be either a tool or a weapon. As modern medical textbooks move forward towards a more holistic approach to patient care and teaching students to see the individual in front of them and not just the pathology they present, it is important to review how training materials endeavor to enforce that message. As the examples I have given you hopefully show, something as innocuous as, again, typeface or choice of images can send strong subliminal messages. Thank you.